So thank you so much for being with us, Matt. I am really excited to talk to you about this. At this point in our conversation, we've been doing a series on faith and the challenges of history, thinking about things like the Crusades, the Inquisition, colonialism, and underlying a lot of that is this question of religious violence. How does that concept work? How is it used? That kind of thing. What is religion and how does it relate to violence? These kinds of things. And for
And
Christians,
we
I
have
think the
actually
question.
talked to somebody already on religious violence, William Kavanagh.
Yeah, that's right.
So at some point, we'd love to hear your take on his work as well, but we won't start there.
Yeah, so you've recently written a book with Cambridge University Press on this, and so I thought it'd be a great kind of addition to that discussion. So to kick things off, how did you get interested in studying religious violence? What kind of brought you to this topic?
Thank you, Austin and Barney, for having me on the podcast. Yeah, I think it sounds a little bit cliche to say that 9/11 was the issue that, like, I show my students in the classroom, we take them onto digital databases, and I put in the terms religion and violence, and you look, and right at 2001, there's that hockey stick curve going up with scholars just writing on religion and violence. And for me, I was a teen in high school, raised in the Christian faith. And I knew very little about religion outside of Christianity and outside of Protestant Christianity. And then all of a sudden, here's another global religion that is just bursting onto the stage with flames and fireballs, right? It's the worst manifestation of Islam, the worst foot forward for that religious tradition. And yet that is what Islam and the Muslim heritage became defined by for a considerable amount of time. And so, that's kind of the earliest thinking in my mind about religion and violence. Um, it was something outside, something that another group had a problem with, not something that was related to Christianity at all. And it's not like I was writing on it at that time in any way, but just kind of deep in my mind, thinking of it in terms of that. I think as I was pursuing ministry at one point, I became aware of the ways in which faith was impacting different people in different ways. In particular, how women were feeling really stifled or controlled through faith. I experienced various moments in my life where people were trying to, control me using faith to do so. Um, and as also politically, the climate was a time of resurgent, what is often called Christian nationalism, kind of in its seeds at the time. And if ever there was a moment when people in what is now the United States took faith seriously and wanted to enact faith in the public sphere, it was Puritanism. And so I decided to do my PhD on Puritanism and specifically on Puritan warfare and look at how their theology changed depending on who they were fighting, right? So they would have thought that they were simply following scripture alone, and yet their faith was morphing under the pressure of politics. And as they went to war, they were changing what they believed about God, about the world, about scripture, what they emphasized in the faith, what they put in the background. And so it's kind of been a really winding path from, Islam and 9/11 to looking at mainly at the Christian tradition. But I think it's been a journey from the problem of religious violence is out there to it's actually much closer to home than often feels comfortable.
Yeah, interesting. I remember talking to you kind of at least early days in my PhD, and I was really struck by that fact that you kind of said, you were interested in like religious violence from Muslims, and then you realized, well, like I can't, fairly be interested in that without also be interested in the tradition that I come from and violence within that context as well. And so starting there, I think is a really honest place to begin and a way into this broader conversation. And since then, you've kind of expanded out some
Yes.
and thinking about
Quite a bit. Yes.
yeah. Yeah, which I think I think I found your work really helpful because you sort of began with the tradition that formed you, and then sort of stepped out into discussing these kind of broader global issues. So when you in your new book on this, I thought it was really helpful in the beginning. You talk about kind of 5 key virtues that might help people think about this topic. And those were curiosity, self-criticism, humility, empathy, and charity. Can you talk us through kind of what that looks like and how that might help position people when they're thinking about this?
Yes, yeah, it seems very underwhelming to start a book, and actually I ended the book the same way, with calling for these 5 virtues, curiosity, self-criticism, humility, empathy, and charity, right? We're talking about massive geopolitical issues. People who are, maybe committing genocide or causing tens of thousands of people to flee as refugees. Why would you start with these very small scale things? And part of it is the fact that most people don't really have much of an impact on geopolitical matters, right? I cannot, stop fighting in Sudan. But what I can do is try to
And slightly
try to
ambiguously phrased, I think if you were fighting in Sudan, you could stop fighting in Sudan.
yes, yes, yeah. But are they going to be picking up my book?
Yeah.
And so for readers of the book, I try to start with religious violence is such a big thing, and when you have such a big thing that's been going on for thousands of years, you can feel debilitated by it, right? There's nothing that can be done about it, and so I try to emphasize these smaller scale things. So, first one, curiosity. I I think that we have a veneer of being educated about others. And in general, I'm amazed at how little we are curious about people we disagree with. So you could think about political disagreements. We have elections coming up in the UK, elections coming up in the US, European Parliament just happened. Very sharp divides. And it's incredibly easy to denounce those you disagree with. But millions of people find those political ideologies persuasive. And in fact, they would find those political ideologies to be loving, and probably as some form of loving their neighbor. Why? We should be more curious. Why is it that somebody thinks that a political candidate you disagree with is persuasive and compelling?
I think
And the
that's
same,
very interesting because I remember reading about the Jewish scholar Michael Wischergrod, who they were trying to explain why he spent so much time reading the philosopher Martin Heidegger, who was a Nazi and anti-Semitic, and they said, well, he thought it more worthwhile to understand than to denounce. And that seems
yes,
to be similar
yeah.
to what you're saying. Like, we should just ask the question, right? Why are these people behaving this way or believing this?
Yeah, and that gets me to one of the later ones. Empathy is kind of related to understanding, and there's this sense in which, if you empathize with somebody, a lot of people think that that shuts down critique, right? I have kind of understood where you've come from. I've walked a mile in your shoes. Now I can't critique you, and I actually think that it's the opposite. Once you have really tried to walk in somebody else's shoes, that's the moment that you understand what makes them tick. And maybe at that point, your critique can actually be sharp. Maybe it can be on target. I think that empathy and curiosity sharpen critique, right? The more we become fascinated with people as people on their own terms, hopefully we can then better critique and to charitably critique them
Yeah,
rather
understanding
than
why
just kind of
somebody
throwing,
does something is not necessarily the same as justifying that thing, right? A
yes.
reason is not the same as an excuse, I would say.
Yeah, and as a historian, right, these are the basics of doing history. You try to get inside somebody else's head to try to think their thoughts after them, right? I don't, in 2024, I don't like being deceived. I don't like committing injustice. Well, people in 1620 didn't like being deceived, didn't like committing injustice either. Why did they think that what they were doing was just? Why did they think that what they were doing was rational? And so as a historian, you try to crawl inside dead people's heads. And well, how does that work in 2024, right? Can I try to crawl inside the head of somebody that I disagree with politically, hopefully to better understand them and also to better critique them? And perhaps maybe I'll find middle solutions. Maybe I will find ways in which we can both live in a pluralistic society and have respect for difference. That's so those are a couple of them. Curiosity, self-criticism. I think we should start with the groups that are closest to us. What would the debates about religious violence look like if Hindus primarily critiqued Hindus, and if the Jewish community primarily critiqued Judaism, if Christians primarily critique Christians, and if atheist and non-religious groups primarily critiqued atheists, right? I'm waiting for Richard Dawkins to come out with his book on the harm of atheism. There is plenty of examples, if you poke in history, at people using the principles that are very close to his own worldview, and using them to create, to destroy human flourishing, right?
Yeah, it's a very provocative example. Yeah.
If we started close to home and reframed self-critique, right? Self-critique is usually something that, you critique something that you hate. But what if you critique the things you love precisely because you love them? If Richard Dawkins is persuaded by atheism and believes that that is the best path to human flourishing, then he should learn to critique it. So that the best version of it is put forward. And the same thing goes for Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, all of those groups. Humility, very briefly, right? If we study religious violence and come away with a sense of, pride and the sense that, we've done everything right, whoever we is, and you've done everything wrong, whoever you are, right? Your study is actually backfired. It's not really working the way that it should work, right? It should, discovering the skeletons in every tradition's closet should make you a bit humble. In my classroom, at one point, I asked my students, do you currently believe things right now that will be studied 200 years in the classroom? And students will be writing essays asking, how in the world did people in 2024 believe that?
That's a great question to ask.
And
how could they have believed things if you're thinking about things that we all believe today?
Every one of us is that way. And then the fifth one, charity, just very briefly, right? Treat other people's tradition with the same care that you want your tradition to be treated, right? So if you get annoyed that that all Christians are painted as the worst version of Christianity, right? Don't do that to Islam. Don't use 9/11 to paint all Muslims as terrorists. Right? Just simple things. Treat other people's traditions with the same care. If you want your own sacred text to be read in context, read other people's sacred texts in context, right?
Sounds pretty obvious when you put
variety.
it that way.
all of these things are really, really obvious, and yet they're almost entirely lacking in these debates, in these discussions. And so that's why, I cannot stop civil war in Sudan, but I can encourage people to adopt these principles. And in fact, not only are they good for scholarship, not only are they good for the discussion of religious violence, they're really useful for living in pluralistic democracies and living with difference. So just on a practical level, if you apply these 5 things, maybe you'll understand your neighbor a little bit better. Maybe you'll understand your in-laws a little bit better, whoever it is, right? They're incredibly useful. They're really obvious, and I think for that reason, we undervalue them.
Or
Mm.
just can
Yeah,
ignore
it's
them
so
because they seem so
insightful.
self-evident.
Yeah, and it's really helpful to think in terms of these kind of virtues, and sometimes also to recognize these aren't things that we can just choose to be. These are habits that we've maybe learned or not learned. And so also recognizing, do I have these habits when I'm thinking about these things? Do I not, and why? How do you develop these habits? And so also, you know, going into the conversation, recognizing some of these I might not. Obviously, if you know, obviously we're all going to say, yeah, I'm going to do all these, but we don't automatically. And so how do we sort of learn and practice these things in the midst of these conversations? And I think you can see, you know, when these discussions go really badly, it's probably evidence that a lot of people in the conversation didn't have these kinds of virtues, right? This ability to, and I think, you know, like humility is this big one where you know, you realize that if I have the humility to understand the dangers on my side of thinking, I'm going to be a lot more compelling to other people as well,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
And I always think that, you know, people on the kind of other side of the political spectrum from me, if they're blind to the dangers on that side, I don't have a lot of respect for their views. But if they get it, then I really want to listen to them, right? And that there's a lot more, I think, to be gained because I can see that they can see what I can see, right? And so those kinds of things I think go a long way. But you know, mentioning in the classroom, this is something I think a lot about as a teacher is how do we sort of train students in these virtues so that they can engage in conversation these ways.
And and a couple of things that I do just really practically is one, I always try to imagine a representative of the group that I'm talking about sitting in the classroom with me. So like I always feel
Mm.
like I've got an empty spot at the desk, or you know, if I'm discussing Islam and violence, right, or any controversial issue, right? Imagine that somebody is sitting there and is going to give you feedback on how fairly you represented them. And so I just always am trying to imagine more people in the room with me than are currently in the room. And so that's one thing. And the other thing is I'm constantly talking back to myself. So religious violence is something that elicits an immediate response, right? You hear about a terrorist attack, you don't have to decide to respond, right? Your body does the responding for you, right? You might feel all the characters of Inside Out in your head, right? You have anger and disgust and sadness, and all of these things just immediately come out, right? When you hear a news story. And that's a good thing. That means you're actually functioning as a human, that you're feeling these things. But I give the example in the book about I used to live in Minnesota, a few miles away from the Mall of America, and a terrorist organization had bombed, a Somali-based terrorist organization had threatened to bomb the Mall of America. And immediately all my inside out characters are running around in my head. And I'm thinking, oh, we need to clamp down on the Somali community. Minneapolis has a massive and vibrant Somali community. It's called Little Somalia, and we need to restrict immigration. We need to all of these things just barge into your head immediately when you hear about a threatened terror attack. But then I didn't stop there, right? I keep working my way around, and I say, well, actually, I know my Somali neighbors, right? I have relationships with my Somali neighbors. I know that the majority of them would never want to do something like that. And in fact, I think immigration makes America a stronger and more vibrant nation, right? Choking off, trying to prevent the one terrorist, right? We might, and so you have those immediate reactions to atrocities done by outsiders, but we can't stop there. We need to dialogue with ourselves and work through like what do we actually value, right? Do we as a nation value hospitality for the refugee? Well, right, we know how to protect ourselves from the Somali refugees by not letting in any Somalis. But that comes into conflict with your other values about hospitality and charity and justice and other things like that. And so constantly talking back to yourself about your knee-jerk reactions about these things. That's one of the things that I tried to do.
Yeah, that's great. I think those are both really helpful. I love that idea of, helping students kind of treat things fairly by saying, okay, we're talking about this topic. There's a representative of this topic sitting in the corner. We're talking to them. How do we do that? And that ability to argue with yourself. I think sometimes we're afraid to be wrong. But recognizing like my knee-jerk reaction to stuff's not always right. That's fine. The question is, what do you do with it? I think that's really, really helpful. And again, especially with students, to kind of foster that space in the classroom of, it's fine if you reacted this way at first, but can you argue yourself out of that?
Yes.
What does that process look like? And hopefully the people around you are helping you do that. All right, so then moving into the conversation a bit, we talked about this somewhat with various other people, but I think just to come around to it again, this idea of secularism as a concept, how does that impact then discussions of religious violence? We have these kind of pair of terms, secular and religious, that are being used to kind of frame this whole conversation. Can you help us navigate that?
In the same way that there isn't just religion, right? There are I know Kavanaugh would kind of dispute this framing a bit, but there are many different religions, and each one of those religions has its own subcategory, and Protestantism has thousands of variations, right? There's Protestantisms, and there's ways of being Baptist within that, and there's ways of being Reformed Baptist within that, right? Lots and lots of different meanings of these terms that we're using, and the same thing goes for secularism. Many scholars talk about secularisms with an S on the end of it. There's versions of secularism that are anti-religion. Think of like the League of Militant Atheists. Who were trying to stamp out all versions of religion within the USSR. That's one version. There's another version that equates secularism with the beliefs that you hold. So secularism equals atheism. And that's kind of a belief-oriented definition of it. And then there's also secularism as a way of resolving disputes in a pluralistic society.
That's an
Maybe
interesting one.
an agreed. Yes, continue.
Do you mean like that we have to leave behind all of our religious assumptions if we're going to talk to each other because we're all coming from different spaces? That sort of an idea.
In some versions, you have to quote unquote leave it behind. In other versions, you can bring your whole selves into that public sphere, but your agreement is not based on any one of your religious groundings, but it is based on an overlapping consensus, right? So let's imagine that you're talking about immigration policy again, right? You could enter that sphere as a Christian, as your whole self, and say, you could speak with two different languages, right? You could appeal to a UN charter about the rights of immigrants and refugees. You could talk about America's history with creating a vibrant culture through accepting immigrants and refugees, right? That's all kind of within the secular, not explicitly religious field. But then you could also at the same time say that Christ was a refugee in Egypt. You could say that loving your neighbor as yourself, appeal to those things. You could bring that whole self into the public sphere and say that, but you're mainly creating the overlapping consensus based on these not explicitly religious things. And this brings us kind of to one of the arguments that I make in the book, that religion, broadly defined, provides more arguments than secularism. So essentially, the religious are able to come at every problem from two different angles. They can approach it on the legal, not explicitly religious angle, maybe looking at things through economics or whatever policy angle on this side. But then they can also give a religious rationale for what they're doing. And what ends up happening then in the public sphere is let's say that let's say that if we go back to immigration, right? I've put forward legal arguments for immigration. I put forward religious arguments for immigration on the other hand. How is that going to play itself out in a news article? Well, the news article is likely going to ignore my legal historical arguments, and they're going to say, somebody is trying to make a religious argument for about the immigration debate.
Because if they don't like your argument, they're going to do that.
If they don't like your argument, they're going to do that.
Because they want to make it sound irrational, and you can make things sound irrational by making them sound like they come from a religious basis.
Yes, and the way that this works out with religion and violence is that religion provides more arguments. It gives you more reasons to forgive, more reasons for vengeance at the same time. It gives you more reasons to unite humanity in one body. It gives you more reasons to separate out humanity. Secularism what I mean by separate humanity is like we are of the true faith, you are not, right? Religion multiplies rationales. It gives people more reasons for what they are doing. What secularism broadly defined does is it gives people fewer things to fight about, but also fewer resources for containing conflict. It gives them it's a pared down there's a pared down list of things that they can appeal to. So essentially, religious people can appeal to twice as much resources. And I view that ambivalently, right? Some of these resources are going to make religious people more forgiving, and some are going to make people more vengeful.
There are more resources on both sides of any particular argument, is what you're saying.
Yes, when you're dealing with explicitly religious groups, you have more rationales because they can approach it from two different angles. Does that make sense?
It's such an interesting part of your book that I hadn't really thought about before, but it's kind of connects with a bunch of other scholars that I've been reading, like Carmody Gray gave this talk about climate change, and she kind of says, the thing that we need to do is not get all the science to everybody, but the question is the formation of desire. How do we get people to desire to care about this? And religious traditions do that really well because they connect more deeply with the things that people value. It can drive them to action to kind of form their desires. That's sort of what these traditions do. And I feel like that kind of gets at what you're saying. And it's not necessarily always good or always bad, but just whatever is happening, there can be sort of more motivation there, I think, in a religious community. I find it a kind of a really interesting and compelling claim. And I think it unsettles a lot of the, people saying just like, oh, I mean, and this is what you're engaging with, right? Religion just causes violence. You're saying, well, religion can cause violence and can do it in sort of unique ways because it really will motivate people in that way. But it also can really motivate people toward peace in a way that secularism wouldn't in other contexts. And so I think it gives us the tools to sort of shift what we're looking for maybe in this kind of discussion.
Yeah, and the way that I frame it in the book is that you can take the legal, historical, other things like that, and say we should value peace, but then faith adds on to it, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall inherit the earth. And that's a thicker sense of the role of what a peacemaker is doing, right? It has cosmic importance, it has eternal importance. And in the same way, a Muslim might say that we should not kill anyone unjustly, but then they might quote the Quran and say that to kill one person is to destroy all of humanity, right? They add on to that this like thicker, this more robust thing, and I really like that you brought up the idea of desire, right? What's one of the biggest enemies of taking anything related to the climate seriously, right? It's desire, right? This desire for accumulation, to have more, to be more, to see more. And desire is an ambiguous concept, right? If you awaken desire, people will run with their desire in multiple different directions. And I've heard you talk about this with vaccine hesitancy, right? That sense in which you try to harness the faith community in order to get behind a scientific consensus. But all of those resources can be used in multiple ways. And I know you've given a lot of thought to, well, how do you awaken this sense of trusting experts and channel it in ways that you find productive.
Yeah, which is a tricky thing, right? Because I think, and a lot of my work is also we're thinking about not in terms of necessarily manipulating religious communities, but helping religious communities engage with the resources they already have in their tradition towards, kind of flourishing and the common good, and how can they navigate that better than they're often enabled to do by, say, secular public health experts. But I think it's that kind of thing, and I find this. It's just such a really interesting. The other thing, like sometimes these questions, people will make these arguments that Western secularism doesn't have a basis for its own ethics. That basis is in Christianity, and I think people often misunderstand those arguments and say oh, secular people don't have ethics. But more, it's just that secular people have less reasons for their ethics, right?
Yes.
So they believe something right or wrong, but they don't have as many layers of that. Whereas a religious person is going to say, right, that's kind of just in general wrong in our society, we've agreed, but also like God says it's wrong, and there's these kind of deeper layers to undergird that, and that's I mean, again, like not necessarily always like objectively better or something, but I think it just helps us understand what's going on in those dynamics, history.
And if I could recommend an author to your listeners, Jacques Berliner-Blau at Georgetown University. He is, I think, the most interesting and thoughtful on these topics of secularism. So he's written a series of books. One is called The Secular Bible. He's essentially arguing that non-religious people need to become religiously literate. Then he has a secularism, the basics, which kind of overviews the field. And I think one of the most interesting ones that he has is How to Be Secular. And these books, so he's one of the few authors who's really being self-critical of secularism, particularly in its relationship to violence and coercion. But also he openly acknowledges that secularism was something that develops largely out of Protestant Christianity, and it developed for very Protestant reasons. And I'm not going to go into the whole history of why that's the case. He has several chapters overviewing this idea, but it does secularism, the procedural secularism, this way of relating to people in diverse spaces. Comes out of a certain version, largely comes out of a certain version of Christianity. And I think that that's actually really key in showing that it is not anti-religious in its core. The people who framed many of, who helped construct this secular sphere, however we define it, did so for very religious reasons. Right? They thought that they could best practice their faith if they had a space in which they could decide on public matters that did not require you to adopt a certain creed or confession in order to fully participate in that society. And so a lot of versions of secularism, what I'm trying to labor here, a lot of versions of secularism can be very uh, um, uh, uh, accommodating to faith, or allow faith communities to thrive, or allow faith communities to live according to their own principles in a diverse society.
Hmm. And one of the maybe distinctions that I sometimes think of is secularism. Sometimes secularism presents itself as the kind of neutral default human world.
Yes.
I think that's not helpful. But when
Yes.
secularism is almost like by contract, we've decided together to create a space where we're gonna, refer to certain things to make arguments together in order to have lived together in a pluralistic society. That kind of thing, I think, can be something that people then have like theological reasons to be invested in. Right? Like Christians have a reason to say that's a valuable sort of space for us to support, not as a kind of default way of being human, but as a way of being a society that is kind of pluralistic. Maybe making those distinctions, I think, might help people, because we often think of just secularism as one thing, right? And so
Yes.
do we like it or not, or something?
And
But there's so many layers here.
and on the issue of violence, you brought up secularism being the default. Nothing could be further from the truth in relation to violence. We often think that the normal way of talking about violence is not bringing God or the sacred into it, and the aberrant version is bringing God or the sacred into it. It's actually the exact opposite. Almost every human on Earth, vast majority of humans, if we think, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism, all believe in some kind of life after death, right? Whether we're talking about reincarnation or paradise, heaven, hell, purgatory, lots of different versions of life after death. The majority of humans believe in life after death. What does killing do? It of necessity, killing brings somebody from life to death and into that space of whatever comes after. And how in the world is a religious person supposed to view killing without bringing their faith into this in some way? Whether that is helping them grieve the loss of a beloved person who was killed in a bombing, or a terrorist who straps a bomb to their chest and says that they're going to enter paradise after this, right? All killing brings humans from life to death. Religion is all about understanding how to live a good life and what happens after death, or I should say many versions of religion. That's a central component to it. And so the point is that relating faith and killing is normal. That's both historically speaking and in the present, that's the normal version. If you were to have an egregious act of violence and somebody were not to think of spiritual matters in some way or another, that's actually the odd thing, historically speaking. And so I'm trying to flip that again. And that doesn't mean that it's a good thing, right? We can think about these things in very harmful ways. We can bring the afterlife into conflict in ways that make conflict so much worse. But relating conflict to the afterlife is the normal way of human interaction. Obviously, not the universal way, but it is the most common. And so I think that Jacques Berliner-Blau is really good on this as well. He talks about just how odd secularism is. This idea that you enter into some public space. It's not like we're just discussing, how high the curbs on our roads should be, right? What are we doing in politics? We're discussing the good life. We're discussing how to distribute resources, how to take care of people who are in pain and suffering, maybe have lost their home country. We're talking about dealing with racial injustice. We're talking about gender inequality, right? These are like massive issues that religion has a lot to say about them. And so this idea of entering the public space and not bringing religion into it in any way is actually quite an odd idea, historically speaking.
Yeah, it's very, very odd. And I think that is, I mean, it's one of the reasons maybe why we have this so-called Christian nationalism kind of coming up, is because people are realizing, like, I've always had Christian reasons for why I vote. Can't I just make those explicit? And of course, the main issue maybe is that they're not really bringing Christian reasons; they're just baptizing secular reasons. But
Yeah, yeah.
but that kind of question of, how does secularism function? And I think, on the one hand, at best, religious people are developing kind of resources to say, listen, this is what we believe, say as Christians, but I can make that argument in a secular frame as well.
Yep.
For the society, the pluralistic society that I'm a part of, and that would be the sort of proper way to make that argument. I think people get really confused about how that might be done well. But then also that, that those things, I think in general, when we're thinking about violence as well, is this gets really mixed up, is kind of, what are people's motivations, and how are they talking about what they did, and how are they, how does this shift whether they're religious or not? And do you think people have a sense that if we didn't think about spirituality or the afterlife, then we would be less violent? Is that one of the arguments for, like, religion is more violent? Or do you think this just changes kind of what killing means, whether you think about the significance of death or not in the midst of it?
So I think that in some ways there's that sense that what coming out of the wars of religion of the 16th, 17th centuries, there were a lot of arguments that we need to quarantine the dangerous potential of religion, find ways in which we can get together, not agree on ultimate reality, but maybe we can agree on reality, right? This here and now, and this creating some kind of a common good. And coupled with that is often a belief that, right, just don't take your faith too seriously, right? Just the problem isn't belief, it's the people who like really believe, right? And again, what I try to emphasize in the book is that both extremism and radicalism and apathy are double-edged swords. So I start the book off with the example of from my own life of a kid that I went to elementary school. We went to the same Christian elementary school. And in 2020, during COVID, I saw a news report from the FBI saying that he had filled up a gasoline canister with petrol, put a Billy Graham evangelistic wick in it, lit it on fire, and put it outside of a Jewish nursing home. In fact, it was the Jewish nursing home that I got my first gym membership at. They had the JCC next door, pumping iron as a teenager. And he had tried to blow up this Jewish nursing home. And we not only went to the same Christian school, we were in the exact same carpool. We sat next to each other. So the line between a scholar of religious violence and a perpetrator is uncomfortably thin. And where was I going with this? So, oh yeah, the less religion. So the thing that really shocked me about this, and I shouldn't have been shocked given what I study, is this individual who's currently in jail. I never thought of him as religious, even as a kid. He did not care about religion at all. His adult life was marked by drug abuse, addiction, crime, other things like that. And in fact, when he went before judges, one of his pleas why this shouldn't count as religious violence was that he wasn't very religious at all. And okay, so he was very apathetic about religion. One of the things that you'll find in the history of religious violence is that apathy and extremism often go hand in hand. Many people who are co-opted into Islamist terrorist attacks, look at what they were doing a year before, 2 years before, right? They were not reading dense theology books. They were not, they were not really taking in much, like really taking in the richness of their own tradition. They were apathetic about Islam. My friend Tobias Kremer has written a recent book called A Godless Crusade. And as part of that book, he's interviewed people at in Germany, France, and America at many of these nationalist rallies. And people will be holding a sign saying, defend the Christian civilization. And a high percentage of these people are not identifying as in any way theologically connected with the
Well, they
Christian
don't go to
tradition.
church. Yeah, they don't
They
go to
don't they
church,
don't
and they don't
they
necessarily believe in an afterlife or anything like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's an excellent book on paramilitary groups in the United States. It's called Bring the War Home, and the author of that book, again, excellent book, not critiquing the book. The author of the book is continually talking about them as Christian groups, right? They're wearing crosses on their paramilitary gear. They're praying, And so I got done with the book, and I emailed the author, and I said, who are they reading? What theologians? Who are they listening to? And she replied back and said, well, they're not really that interested. Not that interested in the tradition that they are claiming. And so I think on the one hand, we look at these issues and we say, oh, the problem of religious violence is the problem of people who take their faith too seriously. Well, apathy is actually one of the on-ramps to extremism, right? What would happen if these Christian paramilitary groups were very serious about the story of the Good Samaritan, right? What if they really took seriously narratives about loving your neighbor as yourself, right? Maybe they're a little bit too apathetic about that, right? Maybe they're not taking that tradition that they're co-opting seriously enough. In Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous letter from a Birmingham jail, right? If we look at apathy and extremism can often go hand in hand. Well, radicalism and extremism, extremism and love and rejection of violence can often go hand in hand. And in the letter to a Birmingham jail, who is Martin Luther King Jr. most frustrated with? He's not most frustrated with the overt racist, right? He's frustrated with the moderate Christians who say, just give race relations time,
Yeah.
just take things slowly. And he's got this famous line in there where he says something to the effect of, at first I was reluctant when people described me as an extremist, right? I didn't like being called an extremist. Who wants to be called an extremist? But then he goes into this long list, was not Christ an extremist for love? Love your neighbor as yourself. And he goes through all of these different things. And then by the end of it, he embraces for himself the position of being an extremist for equality, an extremist for love, an extremist for bringing racially divided communities together, right? Apathy was the problem there. The fact that people were not taking racism seriously was the problem there, and his solution to that is extremism. But it is extremism pointed at love of neighbor. And so one of the things that I try to argue there in relation to apathy, right, in the book, what are you being apathetic about? Are you being apathetic about loving your neighbor as yourself? And then when we look at somebody taking their faith very seriously, which Martin Luther King Jr. took his faith very seriously, what are they being extremist about? Well, he's being extremist about love and forgiveness. And so it matters what we point our extremism at. If we're going to take faith very seriously, what is the end? What is the object that is being pointed at? And for some people, right, some people who are just everyday peacemakers on the ground trying to solve conflicts between different groups, they are deeply passionate about their faith. And they might be described as taking their faith far too seriously. And yet, in some ways, they're the best hope for healing divisions between groups.
Mhm. Yeah, I just think that I loved that point that you made, and I think, you know, I see it everywhere. The places, so many of the places that are most loudly using Jesus for their political movements right now are the most apathetic Christians, right? They're the people who really don't have time for Jesus, really don't have time for the Bible. They have something they're after, and they're using Jesus to advance it. And I was thinking, as a theologian, you know, I'm the odd one out, because I'm like, well, this isn't even Christianity. What are you guys? Why aren't you praying? Like, what's this? And so I think, but seeing that play out, I think is a really yeah, it's really, and I don't think it necessarily, you know, that doesn't let religion off the hook when we think about how it can lead to violence, but just recognizing that the solution is not necessarily that people should take their faith less seriously. And it might be just the fact that, you know, I mean, Christianity in America is declined so much, and people are so apathetic about it, that it's sort of ripe for now being kind of co-opted into these kinds of movements, precisely for those reasons. I mean, I'm constantly being told by people who support a certain presidential candidate that I'm not a good Christian because I don't, and yet those people have never even been to church, right? And so you're kind of like, what's happening? What's happening there? So let's see here. So what do you think then for all of this? Does religion cause violence?
Yeah, let's get straight to the point. How would you answer that question simply?
Yeah, this is kind of where Kavanaugh comes up. I'm not going to go into depth about Kavanaugh. I'll say it for you. You can put that in the show notes. But yeah, so there's a lot of different questions about causality, right? And I wrote an article many years ago looking at several hundred causes, claimed causes of religious violence. Everything from poverty to environment to, you know, history to sacred text, right? There are hundreds of claimed causes of violence. But one of the things that this imagery is not unique to me. There's one way of looking at both religion and sacred text and the issue of causality, and we need to kind of steer between these two. So this comes from Eric Nelson, and he says that people are not, if we imagine like billiard balls on a pool table, right? People are not billiard balls like sitting in motion, sitting still, and then the cue ball comes in, and then all of a sudden they're activated and go do something. Right. So it's not as if people are you know, just kind of in some neutral default state, and then religion comes in and then they do something harmful with it. That's one end that we need to avoid, that sense in which you know, people are acted on by religion, where religion is this thing that is real, that is you know, causing people to act in a certain way. And on the other hand, Nelson essentially says we have to avoid the other side, where it's only humans acting. Right. On the other side, it's only people with desires for power. It's only people who are, you know, trying to get something that they want, and they're twisting religion. They're cloaking their desires. And so on the one side, religion does everything. It sets everything in motion. On the other side, humans do everything. They can make the sacred text say anything that they want, and justify anything they want. And I think kind of there's elements of both of those. And my scholarship has tried to say that we need to avoid those two extremes, but religion really does put a lot of pressure on people, right? It puts a lot of pressure on the way, if you're going to take religion seriously, on the way that you think, on the way you act. It puts a lot of pressure on them to do and say and believe certain things. At the same time, people put a lot of pressure on their texts. And this is much of what my PhD on Puritanism and warfare was about, right? The
Right, that's what you were
situation.
saying earlier, that these people were actually that you could see how the political situation was driving how they were reading the Bible rather than the other way around.
Yes, yeah. And that's, you know, it's an interplay between them, right? Their theology mattered in what questions they were asking about the text and what answers they found persuasive. But you know, why is it that you can read Romans 13 in one historical circumstance and walk away with absolutism as a political philosophy where you have to give total submission to your government, and then another person in another circumstance can read Romans 13, the exact same text, and walk away with rebellion to authority, right? And so I want to point to the historical circumstances, and beyond that, I want to actually point to the hopes, the fears, and the anxieties, right? What is the group hoping for? What are they anxious about? And what are their big fears? And those things are going to have a massive impact on how they approach the text, what they find persuasive in the sacred text, in the religious tradition itself. And this is part of where empathy and other things like that come in. It's through empathy that you figure out what a group is afraid of, what they are hoping for, what is their vision of a good life. And so the way that I think about scripture and religion is, you know, kind of, it's somewhere in between those humans do everything and people do everything, or religion does everything, somewhere in between there. But I think of sacred text not solely, but partly as an ink blot test, where people genuinely approach Romans 13 and they say, I really want to find out what God's word teaches about submission and obedience and accountability. And they genuinely approach it. And one person genuinely pulls out absolute authority for the ruling powers, and the other person genuinely and authentically pulls out rebellion to authority, right? It's an ink blot test. And it's something where we can see their anxieties, their fears, their hopes emerging out of the text in what they find persuasive about the text at any given moment. And this is where, so when we're discussing the issue of authenticity, religion and violence, when we're discussing does religion cause violence, under that, right, there's always this question of authenticity. Is violence an authentic version of Christianity? Is violence authentic to Islam? And I was recently on a panel with Abdullah and Teple, who your readers or your listeners should definitely get acquainted with Imam Abdullah and Teple at Duke University. And he said on this panel, it drives him nuts when people say that the violent versions of Islam are not authentic, right? The people who are committing those acts view them as authentic, right? They think that they are authentically following the Christian tradition. Now, Imam Teple does not believe that that's the right way to practice Islam, and so he makes an argument for a different form of authenticity, right? His form of authentic Muslim faith embraces the outsider, whereas this authentic reaction to the text, the other authentic reaction to the text, tries to destroy the outsider. Both of those, you have believers in Islam authentically approaching their text, genuinely approaching their text, and coming away with interpretations. So what this means, and Abdullah and Teple is really good on this, is that the primary battle needs to take place within Islam, between those two versions of authenticity, right? Not me as a non-Muslim saying, that's the inauthentic version, that's the authentic version, right? That's not up to me to decide. These battles should take place within the religious tradition primarily. And that's why I kind of started out by saying, what would this look like if more Hindus were critiquing the rise in Hindu nationalism that we're currently seeing in India? What would happen if more Christians were critiquing the rise of Christian nationalism in Hungary? right? Or more Muslims were critiquing the same thing going on in Turkey, right? These battles for authenticity within the religious tradition, or say secularism in France, or non-belief in North Korea, or any of these different versions that we have. What is authentic non-belief? Well, is it the North Korean version or is it the French version, right? These battles take place, they should take place primarily within the traditions, I think. And I think that they're most persuasive when they take place within the tradition. So, Austin, if you're able to, argue for vaccines and provide a robust Christian rationale for that, that's going to be far more persuasive than somebody who is not religiously affiliated in any way, trying to say, you should do this because your sacred text says it, right? It's not going to be viewed as authentic to the tradition itself. And so these things, I think, are most persuasive when they grow out of the group, itself.
Yeah, and this I think wonderfully brings us around to how this series began, which was kind of historical challenges to the biblical text itself, and this question of how do you read the Bible? Who decides what it actually says? What's an authentic interpretation of Scripture? And you can see, right, this comes up, right? So when someone does something in the name of the Bible, inside Christianity, we have to ask the question, well, is that a legitimate interpretation of the Bible? And how do we know? And so all of those kinds of interpretive questions. And this was a big thing, when we think about historical criticism, that's one of the reasons why it was developed as a discipline, was a scientific way of proving what the Bible says so that we can keep people from doing dumb stuff with it. Scholars talk about that all the time. And that hasn't necessarily, happened, but that's kind of part of the ideal that they're after.
Yes.
And so I think this is, it's enormously helpful to kind of frame it in these terms.
And the other major faith traditions, they have the same interpretive battles within their groups, and very rich history. Islam has a very long history of interpreting things, and to just say, well, the Quran teaches, right? It's kind of like saying, well, the Constitution teaches, right? We have a very long, rich, and controversial history of interpreting the United States Constitution, right? There's so many ways of reading this one text. And what is Judaism if it is not one long argument with itself, right? There's even just going back all the way to the book of Genesis, right? Abraham arguing with God. Judaism is one long argument with itself about all manner of things. And so to just pull out one strand of it and say, well, this is the authentic form, right? This is the true way of doing it. First of all, as a non-Jew, I'm not really in the position to do that, or not best situated to do that. But then also, right, they have these very rich traditions of plurality of readings. And so I think even just recognizing Muslims who embrace peace are very aware of the violent passages within the Quran, but they have ways of reading that make them embrace their neighbor, that lead them to embrace their neighbor, right? And so then a non-Muslim comes along and says, stops them on a street with the camera going and reads violent passages out of the Quran, right? Most Muslims are already aware of that. And at least with Muslims within many Western societies, they have ways of reading those texts so that they do not lead to violence. And in fact, they might even lead to the opposite. They might lead to embracing outsiders.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think that this part of what we've been wrestling with is this kind of secular versus religious. I think isn't often helpful in these frameworks, but rather thinking about how do particular communities and particular traditions, when and where and how does violence sort of come up in those contexts, and how can those communities and those traditions respond and think, ahead of time about those things. And that's, to my mind, maybe one of the best ways for us to think about this, rather than just people need to stop being religious or people need to stop being this or that. But rather, these things have a particular contour in these contexts. Can we understand that well, particularly by studying history? Right. So for Christians, when and how has Christianity become violent, and what do we do about that as Christians today? Is going to probably get us further than, well, we should all stop being Christians, or at least stop caring so much about it.
Yeah, and
hope that makes us all, peaceful.
and even on the question of control, right? I started out with things like curiosity, self-criticism, humility, empathy, charity, right? Those are more graspable as individuals, but also a religious community cannot stop 100% of its members from doing something harmful with that faith tradition, right? Imagine that there was this person called the Pope who had authorities to set doctrine and practice for all Catholics worldwide. Imagine that somebody like that existed, right? He could tell all Catholics to not do harmful things with their faith. Many of them are going to act on that in very charitable ways, are going to look at that as a further impetus to be charitable towards your neighbors, right? But there's always going to be a subset of groups of people within a group who are going to either ignore or are going to read something in a different way and do something harmful with it. Okay, so you cannot control people 100% of a religious group to the effects where they don't do something harmful with that faith. But what you can control is your response to it, right? So if, and this again is not unique to me, I get this from Abdullah Teple, right? When he cannot stop all Muslims from committing terrorist acts, but he can articulate reasons why that cuts against the grain of his faith, right? He can have responses that say that this is morally revulsive to him as a Muslim, right? He cannot control a couple billion Muslims, but he can control his response to it, and he can argue for why he thinks a better version of Islam should be practiced. So I want to always try to push these things closer to home, and say, that, like my friend growing up, right? Could the school that we had gone to in elementary school have done something differently that wouldn't have led him 20 years later to try to blow up a Jewish nursing home? Probably, but how would you control for that?
Yeah.
But at the same time, I can control my response to it. I've seen some within my community growing up who are kind of like, oh, we're aware of the fact that this person who was part of our community tried to kill Jewish seniors, but we'll just kind of ignore it. It's an uncomfortable truth. An uncomfortable event that didn't really grow out of our community in any authentic way. They just kind of bracket it off and try to ignore it. Whereas I've taken the other approach and have tried to say, no, this really did grow out of that community. Yes, the individual became apathetic. Yes, they, all of these other things. But we need to come to terms with the fact that extremism of the violent form can often be much closer to home than we're comfortable with, right? We can control our response to it. And in the wake of somebody within our community trying to kill Jewish seniors, we can articulate reasons for why that cuts against the grain of the faith.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think that it puts the responsibility on all of us in really helpful ways, to pay attention to these things and to be reflective. And that brings us back around to that humility piece, right? That learning these things can ideally help us be humble about our traditions rather than feeling superior. Thanks so much for joining us today. It's been a really rich conversation. We're glad you could be here.
Thank you
Yeah,
for
thank you
having
very
me
much,
on.
Matthew.